Welcome everyone to this panel on the rules of origin under U.S. trade preference programs. My name is Kent Shigetomi. I'm from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. I wanted to give you a very brief outline of today's program before we start with the presentations. As you can see, there'll be the first part of the program will include speakers who will provide an overview of issues related to preferential rules of origin. Then that group will be followed by speakers from the textile industry who produce in sub-Saharan Africa, and then a representative of a bicycle manufacturer who produces bicycles in Asia, but not always in countries that receive trade preferences. And the question I'd like you to focus on today is to think about, why do companies produce in specific countries? And what is the role that trade preferences play in corporate decision making? Next slide, please. So very briefly, in the United States, we have 5 preference programs, unlike other WTO members, and you can see them listed here today. The ones we'll be focusing on today are the Generalized System of Preferences, the second bullet, and the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, the 4th bullet. You can see that some of our programs are based on a specific geographic area, except for GSP. And it's quite possible that individual countries are beneficiaries of more than one specific program. Next slide, please. In addition, different preference programs cover different products. So as you can see in the bullet points, the coverage of tariff lines varies from program to program. Rules of origin under our preference programs are based on whether a good is a product of a beneficiary country using a regional value content requirement. The United States does not apply a tariff shift method for preferential rules of origin. Next slide, please. So in the United States, we determine whether a good is a product of a beneficiary country based on the amount of originating content in the good. Generally speaking, non-textile products utilize a rule that requires a RVC, or regional value content, of 35% originating content. And in the third bullet, you can see the formula that is used, which is the cost of local materials plus direct cost of processing divided by the appraised value of good. Certain AGOA beneficiaries receive benefits for textiles, which use a cut and sew rule of origin, which allows them to import fabric from third countries to be made into garments in the beneficiary country, then exported to the United States. And depending on the preference program, accumulation with other beneficiaries in that specific program or a specific geographic area and the United States is permitted. So just to reiterate that, preference accumulation can occur within with other program beneficiaries or in a certain geographic area, and of course with the United States. Next slide, please. So if we look at how much of our preferences are actually utilized, we can see that AGOA utilization is quite high. In 2018, it was 86.2%, but total GSP utilization rate was much lower, as you can see, 49.6%. We've also noticed that utilization varies across beneficiaries within the same preference program. So Kenya and Lesotho had utilization rates exceeding 95%, but other beneficiaries had 0% utilization. So again, utilization is quite uneven among beneficiaries. In general, countries with low value of AGOA eligible shipments tend to have low utilization. So for instance, when we look at exports of petroleum from AGOA beneficiaries to the United States, the utilization rate is significantly higher. Next slide, please. So here you can see it's 63.7% for crude petroleum from AGOA and GSP eligible countries in Africa. But even there, we've seen that beneficiaries do not always apply the preferences to non-petroleum exports. We have seen that some beneficiaries have developed national strategies to try to boost their exports under AGOA. And among these countries, all of them have identified agriculture and textiles as key industries. Next slide, please. Oh, is that the, oh, so I did want to highlight some of the work of the WTO here. You may hear several speakers refer to the 2017 Nairobi decision on preferential rules of origin. You can see the 4 parts listed there. The second bullet notes that when countries use an ad valorem system of regional value content measurement, they must calculate that based on the amount of non-originating material unless they're already using a different system. And the decision asks that non-originating materials be allowed to compose 75% of the final value of the good. And WTO members are encouraged to allow accumulation with other LDCs, with the preference granting countries and other beneficiaries and regional groupings. So again, you'll hear this Nairobi decision mentioned frequently today. Next slide, please. Oh, that's the end of my presentation. So again, I wanted to note the structure of today's event. The next speaker will be Darlene Marti from the WTO Secretariat, followed by Stefano Inamo from UNCTAD, and they will provide more general perspectives on preferential rules of origin. So with that, I'd like to welcome Darlene Marti from the WTO Secretariat.
You're muted, Darlene.
Thank you very much, Kent, and good afternoon and good morning, dear colleagues. So my name is Darlene Marti. I work at the Market Access Division of the WTO, and I work as Secretary to the Committee on Rules of Origin. The Committee on Rules of Origin of the WTO is the body, the committee, where trade negotiators, trade diplomats come together to discuss all things related to rules of origin and origin requirements. And in that context, in fact, as you just heard from Kent, we do have a number of instruments, legal instruments that talk about preferential rules of origin for the LDCs. And what I'll do quickly in the next 5 to 6 minutes is just to give you a quick overview about the work that we do in the committee and how we can leverage that work to better understand why some of these preferences might not be used. Next slide, please. So I think the starting point is we have, as I said, these ministerial decisions that date from 2005, 2013, 2015, 2022 about preferential rules of origin for the LDCs. And the objective of these decisions is to ensure that the rules of origin that apply in preferential programs for the least developed countries is to ensure that these rules of origin are simple and transparent in order to facilitate the utilization of the preferences by exporters in LDC countries. And the main decision there is the one in 2015. We call it the Nairobi Ministerial Decision because it was adopted in a ministerial conference in Nairobi. And basically, the main objective of that decision is to give a number of benchmarks, guidelines, and provisions concerning how rules of origin can be designed. And one of the tools that the decision uses is the calculation of utilization rates in order to monitor how preferences are used. And this is a great tool. This has been a great tool for the committee and for members to try to better understand the extent to which least developed countries are actually receiving preferences under the programs to which they are eligible. And when we calculated utilization rates for a number of programs, we see a number of patterns. And one of the patterns that we find is that products that have simple rules of origin, for instance, fresh fruits, vegetables, and plants, don't necessarily always receive a preference. And these are very simple, wholly obtained products. We would expect them to receive preferences. And as you see there, 38% of all exports from the LDCs in this sector doesn't receive any preference. And the assumption that we have, and this is because of a lack of capacity to comply with preferential origin requirements, either the rule or certification of origin or transportation requirements. Next slide. And one of the interesting things is this graph shows preference utilization and preference non-utilization across a number of schemes. And you see there, it varies. And sometimes it varies quite strongly, which is curious because at the end of the day, sometimes the rules are identical. Sometimes they're not identical, of course. So what we try to understand is why products that would be eligible for preferences, why are they actually not receiving preferences? And this would be the red portion of the table that you are seeing here. And as you can see, there is scope to improve utilization for all preference granting members. As you can see here, all of them have a portion of their trade with the LDCs, which is in red, and which therefore is not using preferences despite being eligible for preferences. If we go to the next slide, what I have represented here is annual variations. And this is another interesting pattern. You would expect the utilization of preferences to be fairly stable year after year. But in reality, as you can see here, the size of the column is the proportion of trade that does not utilize trade preferences. So the higher the column, the more trade is not receiving any preferences, the greater the share of trade that is not receiving any trade preference. And as you can see there, there's quite some variation. If we take Korea, for instance, you see that underutilization was increasing. Then we have a peak in 2017, and then this drops quite steeply in 2018 before going higher up. And the question is, why? Why do we have such variations if the rules of origin are constant? How can we explain the fact that we have so much volatility in the way preferences are being utilized year after year? And you can see that for all schemes. The exception perhaps is European Union, where it's been fairly stable, and India, where we have a new scheme. So it's quite normal that utilization and that non-utilization go down after a learning period for exporters. And when you take a look at the next slide, you will see that on the exporter side, LDCs also have very, very different capacity to utilize preferences. As you can see here, non-utilization of preferences can be as high as 90% for the Democratic Republic of Congo and 1% for Rwanda. So Rwanda, 99% of the products eligible for preferences are being exported and using preferences. But when you look at Lesotho or Laos or the countries at the top of this table, the majority of their products are being exported and not receiving any preference despite being eligible for them. Next slide. So the work of the committee really is to try to better understand, to monitor these flows and to try to better understand why this could be. And we've made small contributions, I think, to this discussion. The first one is on transparency, and we've launched a publicly available tool that you can use called the Origin Facilitator. This is a collaboration between the International Trade Center, the World Customs Organization, and the World Trade Organization, where users can find product level rules of origin, so quite detailed rules of origin when you're importing from one country to the other. And we think that perhaps this is a fantastic tool that countries can use to train their private sector and make sure that companies understand the requirements which will apply to them at the border. And in addition to that, we have a number of notes which I've highlighted and hyperlinked here, which any of you can also easily retrieve through the WTO website, where we raise hypotheses, particularly regarding transportation, which seems to be a challenge. When you look at the landlocked, least developed countries, their ability to utilize preferences is lower than the ability of LDCs with sea access. So we raise we discussed transportation obligations. We are also preparing some work on certification and seeing whether certification difficulties could be explained in part at least, non-utilization. And then we raise other hypotheses, like particularly awareness by the private sector, as I said. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And as I said, in the next slide, you will find my details. If you have interest in this area of work in the World Trade Organization, I've hyperlinked there the page of the customs, the committee on rules of origin. And I've also added my details so that you can get in touch to learn more about our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. Our next speaker is Stefano Inama from UNCTAD.
Thank you very much, Kent. And I'm Stefano Inama. I'm working at UNCTAD. And our main role at UNCTAD on rules of origin is to enhance the utilization rate by firms and also enhance the capacity building of developing countries and LDC negotiators in implementing better rules of origin. So I would like to thank you for your invitation, and my presentation today is about the drivers of utilization rate, pointing out of some myths, the facts, and the work I had. Next slide. What about the myth? I think that Darlene in the previous presentation has pointed out to the issue of utilization of trade preferences. And in some cases, the utilization are low. And then there is a kind of stereotype or myth, conventional wisdom that says preferential utilization of trade preferences are low because at times the preferential margin are low. And so firms, rather than complying with rules of origin, decide to forego the tariff preferences and pay MFN rate of duty. In reality, the picture is much more complex than that. In fact, the preferential margin are one of the elements of a firm decision, among others, to locate production in a beneficiary countries. Apart the investment climate and work cost and worker rights, in the terms of the decision of a firm to locate and use trade preferences, profit margins and trade volumes play a significant role. By profit margin, I would say, that in certain sectors, the profit margin of firms are relatively little and the competition is fierce. There, even a low preferential margin may make a difference. And also, the use of trade preferences is linked to the volume of trade. And think about, for instance, to give an example, to the automotive industry in the US, Canada, Mexico Free Trade Agreement. The preferential margin in the US market is as low as 2.5%. However, this relatively low preferential margin is attractive to firms to use it, and also is attractive to government to regulate the rules of origin. And so the Trump administration paid a lot of attention in renegotiating rules of origin for the automotive industry in the USMCA agreement. So preferential margin is one of the elements, but what matters the most is the profit margin in the industry, for instance, automotive, and the volume of transaction. These are the real drivers of a firm decision in utilizing or not trade preferences. Obviously, this varies between sectors and sectors in the sense that in the steel sector that is hugely competitive, a low preferential margin matters a lot. In the fashion industry, is relatively lower because the profit margin are higher and there are other factors that plays in the decision making of a firm to use or use not trade preferences. Next slide. Let's move to the drivers, the real drivers of utilization rate. One of the facts is that the leniency or the stringency or rules of origin are drivers of utilization rate. We did a paper, I did with LDCs, what was presented at the Committee on Rules of Origin in 2014, that showed that more lenient rules of origin criteria introduced by EU and Canada reforms led to higher utilization rate, trade volume, and also induced firms to locate industries in beneficiary countries. Another fact that drives, the utilization rate is the methodology used to draft the rules of origin. In a word, I could say that certain rules of origin that are based on use of non-originating material, from an accounting point of view, are easier to comply with that rules of origin that are based on a value-added method, since they require a more complex accounting. But overall, from the leniency or stringency equation of rules of origin and now they drive utilization rate, the caveat and the lesson learned that we draw from the research we carried out with partners is that they must be measured against the manufacturing requirement and related to the firm location and supply of inputs. In a word, the same rules of origin for a firm located in Africa with a relatively shortage of suppliers is very much different from the same rules of origin operating in Asia, where a firm has available a lot of suppliers or of intermediate material to produce finished products. So the same rules of origin in different regions or different countries may have different implication in level of stringency or leniency. Next. The second factor is that the rules of origin are composed of two elements. One is the compliance with the rules of origin criteria, and the second one is how you demonstrate that you complied with the origin criteria. And then comes with the certificate of origin that for the goods is like a passport for the human beings. Now, how much is it difficult to get a certificate of origin for a firm that is exporting? In some countries, the certificate of origin in certain administration need to be stamped by certifying authorities, which is quite the contrary of a trade facilitating practice. While other modern administration, they are relying on self-certification rather by exporter or by the importer. I think Darlene also quoted the issue of evidence of direct consignment. In some cases, some preference-giving countries require evidence that the goods have been shipped directly to the country, kind of through bill of lading or other documentary evidence, which is quite difficult to comply with. And of course, there are other additional requirements in terms of administration, which may make the use of trade preferences difficult. So all in all, if you add the fact 1 and fact 2, then it's all combined to a firm's level decision to use or not to use the trade preferences, of which, based on many components, of which one is the level of duty preference or the preferential margin. The one is the profit margin in the industry. The other one is the flexibility in sourcing and manufacturing decision, because a firm needs to use intermediate inputs. Are they available where they are located? Are they timely? Are they supplied in a constant manner, quality-wise and time-wise? The company culture and organization, and also the estimated implementation cost, because you need to have a customs manager. And some of the firms are also using software which are costly to buy and operate. All in all, this is a firm decision to utilize or not utilize utilization rate. Next. Now, the challenges that we identified, I mean, after that I explained a little bit the complexity, is that the low AGOA utilization rate, like the result of a medical test, a scan, an echography, they need to be read by a professional and understood in order to find, I mean, the disease and the correct diagnosis and the link to the rules of origin. So it depends from sector, from firms, and from the market involved. They do not provide a magic solution. They provide a tool, an indication on how to solve the problem. One issue that once you solve the problem, another issue that you may face is the fact that governments may be denying that certain rules of origin are not facilitating. Obviously, they negotiate and they implement these programs. They don't want to be said that the rules of origin are not effective. So there is a problem there, I mean, that we have identified. The governments tend to be on denial mode in accepting the reason for low utilization rate. Another challenge that the literature on rules of origin and research are so far paid scarce attention to these operational modalities. This is something that we tried to address by making research, I mean, that could serve to government to make progress and cooperate on rules of origin that are trade facilitating. Last of these challenges is that the transparency. A lot of progress has been made in the Committee of Rules of Origin in WTO on utilization rate, but the availability, the public availability of utilization rate are so far limited to Quad countries and some other preference-giving countries, and it should be made more public, and not only the trade preferences for unilateral trade preferences, but also under FTA should be progressively made more available. Next. A few words of the work ahead. We will be presenting with the Asian Development Bank a paper on the G20. Now, I mean, the G20 could resume initiatives on rules of origin multilateral level. There is much work that needs to be level. As you know, we have a WTO agreement on rules of origin, but it is not entirely operational. And therefore, I mean, this gap, I mean, should be filled. And we also carrying out research and capacity building on conversions of product-specific rules of origin, because we've seen that even if there is no an agreement on rules of origin, the countries tend to naturally converge on some product-specific rules of origin. And this could be a way in which we could have a greater trade facilitation, because all the product-specific rules of origin in many free trade area agreement show some sign of convergence, and this could facilitate compliance with the rules of origin. Also, we are publishing a first study on COMESA intra-regional trade, intra-African trade utilization trade preferences, which will be published in 2023, and we will make an assessment of the rules of origin in the African continental free trade area, which is the newcomer of these mega regional free trade areas. Another one is in Asia, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Last slide, which basically next is showing, I mean, the resources. Much of what I say is contained in UNTAL studies and or done with other in partnership with other organizations, and also my recent publication on rules of origin international trade by Cambridge University Press. I thank you very much in your attention, and I remain in touch with the organizer and the participant to this interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. At this point, that concludes our overview speakers, and now we'll be turning to our industry experts to talk, who will talk about their individual organizations' experiences in dealing with issues related to preferential rules of origin. Our first speaker.
Thanks, Kent. I'll take over from here. Thanks,
Thank
everyone. My name is Paul Fekete. I'm a senior international trade advisor with the U.S. Agency for International Development. As Kent has mentioned, we've had a number of excellent overview presentations from our experts. We thought it would be useful now to invite a number of representatives from the private sector to speak a little more about the individual decisions that are made at the company level. Let me remind participants that more extensive bios of all of our speakers is available on the U.S. mission site in Geneva. For now, let me first introduce our first speaker, Patrick Fox, who is the Senior Director for Customs and Trade Strategy with the VF Corporation. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to present today on the panel. Go ahead to the next slide. I want to start by giving some high-level context of who is my company, and then delve into the supply chain. I think it will provide excellent context for this discussion around preference programs, utilization rates, rules of origin. VF is the parent company of 12 brands. You can see them listed here. The largest of those brands of which are Vans, The North Face, Timberland, and Williamson-Dickie in that order. Our annual turnover is nearly $12 billion. We market our products in over 125 countries. I think it's worth noting, while we sell our products in 125 plus countries, we're the direct importer in only about 18 of those jurisdictions. And an important theme that will come out of the conversation today is also around our purpose. At VF, we live our purpose. You can see it written in the top right. And it's a first order condition to sourcing decisions. Factory compliance and adherence to our global compliance principles are really first order conditions before we can even get into the analytics of trade and preference program decisions. Next slide, please. So the supply chain at VF is large scale complexity. Our task is to manage that complexity. You can see the figures here. We manage the global trade compliance activities for nearly 500 million units shipped around the world and across international borders every year. Our team, the team of customs and trade professionals around the world, and it's a group of around 60 plus trade professionals, we make tariff decisions on every one of these products every season, and the tariff decisions feed directly into preference programs, rules of origins, determinations, and sourcing decisions. We cannot manage this complexity without systems, and even with sophisticated technology, it never runs perfectly. Next slide, please. So more on the supply chain and the scale at which we operate and need to manage our businesses. Consider the 12 brands you saw earlier. Consider the range of product categories from within those brands, from technical footwear to apparel to high-end, both high-end and basic gear. We make gear that mountaineers climb to the top of the highest mountains in the world, as well as backpacks that children take to school every day. We make basic sneakers and advanced mountaineering shoes. So out of this picture, imagine the spaghetti bowl of preference programs, trade agreements that are possible. And consider that duty is one of the, if not the largest component of landed cost of a product, aside from the cost of the product itself. Next slide, please. Very briefly, we proactively manage our global footprint to reduce risk exposure. And even before COVID, this type of risk management and sourcing balancing was central to our supply chain strategy. And I would go further to say post-COVID has exerted more pressure on companies like ours to justify sourcing mix. Nearshoring is certainly becoming more prevalent, and managing these risks certainly have a bearing on preference rules and utilization rates. Next slide, please. So this slide, in a nutshell, boils down the sourcing decision. it really is quite simply these three factors: capability, capacity, duty, and landed cost. Within duty and landed cost, you could break out lead time for both raw materials, lead time for finished goods to the import countries, import markets. You could break out of landed costs freight rates. Obviously, freight rates are a major concern these days, as well as port congestion, both at origin and at destination. So these are all considerations we have to make. And when it comes to duty, it's about weighing what is the preference rate against the most favored rate for that product. For the U.S., many apparel and equipment categories, the duty rates are quite high, well in excess of 20%. Many significant categories of technical outerwear have duty rates of 32%. And so what is the tipping point for a sourcing decision in this context? Do factories have capabilities to make technical outerwear like our brands demand? Or do they only have the capabilities to produce basic sneakers, basic garments, t-shirts, bottoms, and the like? Do we have the capacity that's needed to meet the volumes and the demands that we have in any given product season? And what is the lead time of raw materials that qualify for the preference rates? Are they long lead times? How long in advance do you have to plan for those lead times? Will dictate what kinds of programs we can feasibly source in countries where there are preference programs. Next slide, please. And of course, we must consider rules of origin. Do our vendor factory partners, are they knowledgeable of the rules of origin? Many times we go on audit trips and factories simply are not knowledgeable. They're even the basics. Is there sufficient in-country training? We very often do not directly source the raw materials or inputs that go into the production of our goods. Rather, we rely on factories to source these materials instead. Can we rely on their decision-making? We plan years in advance when it comes to raw materials. So certainty that preference programs will not expire is always a concern. If there's a risk, even that a program may expire 3 years from now, that's a risk we have to take into consideration. Global optimization is always desired. Does the origin country have different rules vis-a-vis other import markets? In such scenarios, are the rules different? And then managing to the lowest common denominator, i.e. the strictest rule, would probably have to be undertaken. Next slide, please. So overall, you know, the preference utilization decision and our drive to source from origin countries, you know, really boils down to the simpler the rules, the better when it comes to these decisions. There's less risk, more certainty, more availability of raw materials if the rules are simpler to meet the ever-changing demands of our consumers in what are seasonal businesses. Difficulties, raw material lead times, uncertainty of renewal if and when programs expire, paperwork, substantiation of preference claims to the customs authorities where we import is often antiquated and outdated. Other factors we consider, which I mentioned before, first and foremost is adherence to our company's global compliance principles, laws, and regulations, the ability for factories to meet sustainability standards, such as our wastewater, VF's wastewater standards. Suggestions for improving utilization, better in-country training. Factories very often do not know or understand the requirements. Better systems to handle the chain of custody of information often required to support preference claims. And with that, I'll turn it over to my next colleague on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Patrick, for your presentation. Our next speaker is Ken Williams. Ken is the PVH hub leader for Africa and the Middle East region. Ken, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And again, thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you today. In slight contrast to Patrick, I'm going to try and come at it from a slightly different lens. I've spent 17 of the last 34 years in the industry, based here in Africa, in North or East Africa. So maybe rather than just look at things from the outside in, maybe I'll try and give you an insight on looking inside and looking around on some of the challenges that we have. So first of all, who are PVH? So PVH is a little like Patrick's business, owns a basket of brands. It's been around and established for quite a long time, as you can see, since 1881. And it's a $9 billion business. We operate, and what I mean by operate, I mean manufacture in over 40 countries. Next slide, please. The business is driven by two distinct items, two distinct brands, I should say, which is Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger, both global brands and retail across all our platforms. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned there about Africa and specifically, our experiences under AGOA and indeed other trade deals, but particularly in this instance, AGOA, and how we felt that Africa really did offer a compelling reason to come to the region. We know that apparel historically usually is one of the industries that creates a bridgehead into new and developing countries, employs a lot of people, generates foreign exchange. There's a lot of technology transfers there. Recently, I think we've seen that there's been an incredible change in the dynamic around the world, lots of rising costs and trade headwinds in much of Asia and the Indian subcontinent. We've also had some challenges with various governance when they come to applying and maintaining regulatory compliance. And I think that in itself, plus the fact that we were looking for somewhere that we could actually develop all of that skills and knowledge into one landed opportunity, made us look at East Africa. We scoped the region. We visited all the countries in the region, did extensive granular deep dives, and began operations in 2014, 2015. We've been resilient. We've been able to absorb some of the slings and arrows that you inevitably get when you're starting a new frontier program in a region. But to date, we've found it to be a very challenging but very rewarding environment. Along the way, of course, we've been able to incorporate an incredible amount of the things that we would love to have done in other parts of the world, particularly around the environment and social sustainabilities. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, and I've made this very intricate for Paul. I do apologize, Paul, because this has got a multiple click screen on it. I do apologize. If you could click one more time for me. I wanted to emphasize this element, particularly government support. Okay, we really wanted to engage with governments that really understood what it meant to be a best-in-class location. Obviously, the standard ticket to the game of several investment incentives is standard in the industry and is standard around the world. But we really wanted to have a shared vision. All right, we wanted to meet people in the governance of the countries that shared our vision, that met our values, were happy to adapt and develop. Obviously, the component of duty we've talked about extensively, and the purpose of this is understanding that the AGOA Opportunity Act underpins really the logic for coming to a region or a country. It's also, of course, can be an FTA, as we have in some countries we manufacture in. But also, it's important to note that it's only one of the building blocks that we have. For example, I've just stated there that Ethiopia and Kenya, between them, have duty-free agreements with some 94% of where we sell our garments. Thank you. Costing will always be in the top three, I think, of things that we look for. We've also got to look for, the trainability and availability of labour forces at competitive rates, and obviously that we got renewable, low-cost energy sources, and that we're working in an environment where we can establish a scalable business in a reasonable amount of time. So, for example, Ethiopia has, is the second most populous country in Africa, which was one of the criteria why we went there. And then risk mitigation. Along the way, we wanted to introduce some new technology, new appreciations that we weren't able to do in other parts of the world. So, for example, we put in a zero liquid discharge facility in our plants in Ethiopia, recognizing that the water supply in that region is a challenge. We also want to bring in or move away from, I should say, some of the standards and disciplines that we've had in other parts of the world that we won't be able to shake off in any reasonable amount of time. In other words, this is the last chance to get it right. Next slide, please. So in summary, and we're advocating this approach because I think it does work. We defined a common approach with the governments and various trade agencies, investment authorities, labour organisations and NGOs. We engaged with multi-stakeholders for that shared vision, so it had to be something that everybody believed in. We went for a strong focus on verticality from day one, in other words, full supply chain, on obviously attributes along the lines of ethical and environmental initiatives do that. But I did want to emphasize that in our industry, mills drive jobs. So without a fabric component onto your supply chain, then sometimes your roots are fairly shallow in this sector. And we wanted to establish standards of environmental, ethical and labour proclamations with the sustainability element at the core. Obviously, that sounds like a badge of honour. It's not. You've actually got to walk the walk on this. And obviously the things, particularly as we focus on labour proclamations, we find that in this region, some of the labour standards and labour laws are a little bit out of date and need refurbishment, and we will work with you and lean in on that and give you best practice and guidances around the world. We'll obviously incorporate entities such as the ILO as well to give us their inputs. Next slide, please. And then finally, from a sort of like a granular look at things, on the things that maybe we've found a challenge as we've gone along on our journey in Africa. There are many things that are misunderstood, but the most common ones are that whenever you start a new business in this particular sector, there are always going to be some constraints, and some of the challenges that we come across around business registration and business licensing, immigration constraints, when we try and do a technology transfer of people and knowledge and skills, visas and work permits become an issue. Some of the customs and duty parameters are a little bit antiquated. And these are the things that when the board has decided to evaluate a country and assess it and give a green light to going on to the next level, these are the sorts of things that tend to come out in that deep dive evaluation. There are things that people also confuse themselves around what brands might consider to be optional and what in fact are industry requirements. We don't actually have any latitude for anybody who doesn't comply to things such as building regulations, electricity installations, fire and safety regulations, human rights records are considered. We want to be engaging with the people that are standard bearers, as I mentioned there, people like the ILO. And also we need to appreciate that this is an agile environment, it's a free moving environment. So the prominence of sustainability in our supply chain needs right now is growing, and it will continue to grow. I think everybody now knows that the biggest growth sector in the apparel sector is actually to do with replenished, reused, circular product. We need to be able to facilitate that in any new investment that we move into. And then finally, we'll always look at things like the banking apparatus and the inland freight options and port authority options. And of course, eventually, we'll always have a look at sort of political stability and anything like that that goes along with post-investment. So these are the sort of granular things that we look at when we when we see a deep dive opportunity to move into a new country. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening. I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Ken, and thanks very much for those excellent slides, particularly the one that lays it out in terms of their relationship to each other. Our next speaker is Greg Poole. Greg is the Chief Supply Chain Officer for the Children's Place. Greg, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Kent. Good afternoon, U.S. trade representatives, World Trade Organization member countries. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on how exporting countries can improve utilization of the U.S. trade preference programs. I'm Gregory Poole, the former Chief Supply Chain and Sourcing Officer at the Children's Place and now Special Advisor to our CEO. Next slide, please. Headquartered in Secaucus, New Jersey, the Children's Place is the largest pure-play children's specialty apparel retailer in North America, with annual revenues of $1.9 billion in 2021. We design, contract to manufacture, and sell high-quality merchandise for children at value prices. We source our products from a diversified network of third-party vendors across Asia, the Americas, and Africa. In the past 5 years, Africa has become an increasingly important sourcing region for our company, which I will discuss in more detail later in this presentation. But first, I want to begin with how we as a company view sourcing, both in terms of strategy and approach. Next slide, please. We see our sourcing strategy as contemporary and progressive. Sourcing for us is about ensuring a constant flow of high quality merchandise at optimal speed and cost while mitigating the impact of macroeconomic headwinds. So it's all about balance and maintaining a diversified global network of vendors and factories. Next slide, please. All of our sourcing decisions are made through a lens of responsible sourcing. We strive to protect and enhance our brand by seeking to positively impact the lives of the people who make our products, the communities, and the environments affected by our business. There are 3 pillars to our responsible sourcing program. First is safe and fair factory working conditions. Second, worker well-being programs that are targeted to improve the lives of the workers and their communities. And third, programs to reduce water, chemical, and energy usage. Next slide, please. So how we source. We use a variety of networks to engage, screen, and validate vendors and countries prior to selection and engagement. So it starts with the countries. Does the country have the fundamental requirements to support our business? Is there political stability? Is there available labor? Is there sufficient power and water? Is there the general infrastructure, including roads, rails, ports, and airports to support our businesses? We then focus on identifying vendors and factories. Our reputation often precedes us. The Children's Place is known as a pioneer, a buyer who is willing to support and develop new vendors and factories. We're also often introduced to vendors through a network of industry associations, trade shows, and even government agencies, like this event today. Once we've identified the viable vendors, we start to build, cultivate, and nurture the relationships. And for us, this process typically takes between 12 and 18 months before the first shipment is made. Next slide, please. Selecting the right country is dependent on relative cost and capability. Relative cost is about labor, utilities, freight, logistics, banking terms and regulations, and any potential government incentives that may be available for investors. Relative capability is about a vendor's ability to produce our product, as well as the surrounding infrastructure to support the production and shipment of our products. In our experience, we see these countries go through a cycle of evolution. The cycle starts with the vendor being low cost and relatively low capability. We would consider this to be an emerging environment. Over time, the vendor's capabilities improves and their costs remain low. But then with more time, capabilities continue to improve, but costs begin to rise. We consider this peaking. Until such a point in time when the costs come so high and the country and the vendors become no longer relevant for the children's place. We consider this the sunsetting phase. Next slide, please. The children's place has a unique hands-on vendor and factory support model. Technical experts are on the ground, ready and willing to support new vendors and new factories. Being present and highly visible in the market demonstrates our commitment to that country and to those vendors in the community. This unique support mechanism that helps build trust and secure long-term capacity. Next slide, please. I now want to turn to Africa and why we focused our sourcing efforts in that region. The African Development Bank reported Africa as being the world's second fastest growing continental economy. Africa is home to more than 1.2 billion people and has a population that is projected to double over the next 30 years. In 2019, Africa exported approximately $8.4 billion of product to the United States, approximately $1.4 billion of which were textile and apparel products. The textile and apparel industry in Africa alone employs more than 450,000 people, the vast majority of whom are women. Next slide, please. The Children's Place has been sourcing from Africa since 2000, the same year that the African Growth Opportunity Act was enacted. In the past 5 years, Africa has become increasingly important sourcing region for our company, and in 2021 accounted for over 25% of our source volume. A key driver of our sourcing decisions in this region is the full and continued access to the benefits that AGOA brings to our company, employees, customers, and our sourcing partners. AGOA supports American companies in importing and selling high-quality, affordable merchandise to American consumers. This merchandise, produced in African factories, employing hundreds of thousands of African workers, the vast majority of whom are women, who experience significant economic uplift as a result. We are currently working with third-party vendors and factories in 6 African countries: Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And we are in the process of bringing on suppliers in 4 additional countries: Benin, Madagascar, Togo, and Uganda. Next slide, please. Our manufacturing partners in Africa are working to build a self-sufficient, resilient, closed-loop manufacturing system. This is an ecosystem that minimizes the needs to import raw materials from other countries, creating a unique and distinct competitive advantage and magnifying the positive economic impact for the continent. AGOA has been a key catalyst and driver of this progress, and its early renewal will likely increase future investment from government and private sectors in the African economy, with resulting benefits to the African people and the US economy. In recent years, we have seen the development of large-scale, state-of-the-art industrial parks in Africa. These turnkey industrial parks offer factories and warehouses that enables the rapid startup of light manufacturing. These industrial parks have state-of-the-art, environmentally friendly systems and equipment, such as zero-discharge wastewater treatment plants, and also provide a full range of supply chain services. These growing facilities play a critical role in the socio-economic development of these communities. We believe that the continued successful growth and operation of these industrial parks and the development and building of new industrial parks, along with the surrounding housing and infrastructure, and the employment of hundreds of thousands of African workers is dependent on the long-term renewal of AGOA. Next slide, please. AGOA supports economic development, employment, and the livelihood of garment workers and their families in Africa. In an effort to make a lasting, positive impact on the lives of the people who make our products and their communities, the Children's Place partnered with Plan International USA to establish an early childhood development center for apparel factory workers in Ethiopia in 2022. The Child Care Center provides much needed childcare services to the workers in the Havasa Industrial Park, the largest industrial park in Ethiopia, and will reach over 1,000 children and adults when the center is operating at full capacity. We will continue to pursue worker and community support programs in Africa in the future. Next slide, please. In conclusion, since its enactment in 2000, the African Growth Opportunity Act has been at the core of US economic policy and commercial engagement with Africa. AGOA supports American companies in importing and selling high quality, low cost merchandise for American consumers. AGOA provides strong foreign investment opportunities in Africa. AGOA allows American companies to reduce their reliance on China for sourcing products. And AGOA supports economic development, employment, and the livelihood of garment workers and their families in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I'm going to ask for the indulgence of both our speakers and our participants. We are running a little over time, but I think there are some excellent presentations here, and we have one final one. Our last speaker is Robert Markovicus, who is the Executive Vice President of Specialized Bicycle Components, based in California, an importer and distributor and manufacturer of bicycles and components. Bob, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. And it's a great honor to be here. I appreciate the time and the energy. I know we're running late. And we're going to switch gears a little bit here. Specialized, if you can, next slide, Paul, that would be great. Specialized, we're in a high valued business, which is quite different than what we've been looking at for the previous presenters. And we're in an industry that really has very high switching costs. So we don't have the opportunity to move from one country to the other very quickly because we have high capital investments in machinery, equipment, tooling, and other things. So our strategy and our sourcing decisions are quite different than perhaps some other businesses and how we manage going forward. So let me give you a little bit of background about Specialized. So we are a bicycle company. Some of you may recognize there's lots of Specialized bikes around. 95% of our bikes are imported from around the globe, and we have an annual turnover of just over 2 billion. And the majority of our sales are bikes. And we primarily source from 4 sources around the world, which is China, Taipei, China, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And what I'm going to do is, other than talking a little bit about specialized, I'm going to take you through the state of sourcing beyond rules of origin and tariffs, a little bit about how we make decisions as a brand and as a company. What is a framework for making our decisions and what countries of origin that we go to, and just some advice for everybody on how to attract industries and what are the important ingredients to attracting businesses and industries. So next, Paul. Okay, what are the trends that we see in sourcing? So after the pandemic, right now, we're seeing trends in sourcing that businesses today are moving from transactional businesses to integrated supply chains. So what does that mean? So what it means is that we're starting to see integration of individual components and suppliers coming together, forming relationships and partnerships that mean something, that form successful ways of operating going into the future. We're also seeing a lot of industry consolidation, but it's still very highly fragmented. For us, we're seeing a mix of Asian and near market sourcing, and we're finding that to be really critical in us meeting shorter timelines and shorter lead times, and to lowering our operating and our cost of importing or actually integrating products. Safety and compliance. I know all of the previous the speakers talked about safety and compliance and how they're becoming much more important going forward in the sourcing world. There's of course a lot of interest in free trade agreements, whether it's GSP or whether it's other free trade agreements, and as they relate to sourcing. And for us in specific, since we are importing from various countries around the world, free trade agreements have an important impact on sources and countries where we select. And of course, GSP and other multilateral trade incentives are important for us. Next slide, Paul. So how do we choose a manufacturing location? What are the factors? And some of the other speakers have gone through these, but we do look at net cost. What is that? Materials, labor, utilities, finance, transport, duty. How are reliability? Specified product delivered on time every time. We want that. We do look at capacity. What is the local infrastructure? Is there stability? Ports? What are the roads like? What are the power supplies? What is the infrastructure like? And what are the buyers' long-term confidence in that particular manufacturing operation? And what about local material availability, whether it's alloy, whether it's forging, whether it's forming materials, or whether it's individual components that we need? And becoming really critical are what are the ethical and environmental compliance elements to that particular manufacturing location. So important elements for us in choosing our manufacturing location. Next, Paul. I'm going to just take you through a couple of these. So what are the things that we look at when we're looking at a location? This is a good example. We go through a pretty simple SWOT analysis. So here's just a simple one on China Taipei. What does China Taipei offer for us in the bike business? There's a lot of local content. They're into horizontal production. We have a large government investment in the industry. There's lots of people who speak English, particularly as it relates to export. They're innovative, have a lot of interest and engagement in tech products, and a highly skilled labor forces. But what are the threats that we have? So there's lots of strengths, but We're dealing with political uncertainty, labor shortages, alienation, currency, weather, and earthquakes happen to be a challenge that we deal with from the threat side. Next, Paul. And I'll just look at one other country, just as an example, Cambodia. We're now very deeply invested in Cambodia. And what are the attractive features of Cambodia for us? So minimum wages are quite low. It's an LDC country, and we enjoy GSP treatment into most major markets, which includes US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, we like the concept that there is GSP treatment. We have abundant cheap labor, factory standards that are monitored very aggressively through government agencies. There's good transport links, particularly out of Phnom Penh, and they're improving the road and the logistics infrastructure. So what are the threats? Lots of companies will source elsewhere if there's strikes and threats. That's certainly a challenge for us. There's increasing competition from other low-cost countries. There are salary disputes. Recently, Cambodia lost the EBA, everything but arms status, to the EU due to human rights violations. And there's a potential that Cambodia may lose some GSP status with the US over environmental, labor practices, human rights, and gender diversity. Next slide, Paul. So where are we going? And this is the last slide before dinner. What the future holds. So what I see the future holds is the days of chasing cheap labor sources are over. That really can't be a factor in consideration for sourcing anymore. It's not necessarily labor cost, but it's freight cost, it's utility cost, it's fuel cost. There are other considerations behind just the cheapest source. And integration across supply chains, that speed to the market is important. Today, we believe that it's the fast that eat the slow. It's not the big that eat the small anymore. And those days are long over, and we're going to start seeing integration, and we're going to start seeing speed to the market as being an increasing element to trying to satisfy and service needs. Process improvements are happening with digital technology. We're starting to see digital 3D printing in a lot of products. And again, those are elements that are easy to automate. They're simple. Many of them require minimal investment, and they improve the efficiency and the overall productivity, minimize labor, lots of elements and lots of excitement that's in both product automation and in machinery automation. Greater local production for local consumption. And that too is a factor in our consideration. We want to service products and build products that are consumed locally as well. So it's not only about export, it's not only about what we can do and what markets we can service, but also how can we service local markets to better satisfy needs that are in the local communities. So, and what are new hot sourcing hotspots? Central China is certainly a hotspot. Myanmar, Sub-Saharan Africa, Tanzania. Other future things that hold greater global flexibility, a rise in near sourcing for Europe and North America. Free trade agreements are in course an element. Corporate responsibility, extending to the entire end-to-end supply chain. Critical. Sustainability, zero carbon footprint, focusing on greenhouse gas, scope 3 emissions. And my advice to everyone on the call, make history or be history. Be aggressive, because you're either at the table or on the menu. So thank you for that. And my contact information is there. And again, I appreciate everybody staying and listening.
Thanks very much, Bob, for your presentation, and thanks to all of our industry representatives for, I think, some outstanding insights into the decision-making processes that all of you go through. I think it's very apparent that there is no one factor alone that really drives the process, but it's really a much more complex network of issues that really need to be addressed. I do believe that we are in a position to take some questions from our audience. If anyone wants to raise their hand and come off mute and pose a question. Let me see if there is anyone who would like to do so. While we're waiting for that, let me pose a question, and I know that all of you have touched on this in one fashion or another. At USAID, you know, as development professionals, we're very intent on working more closely with our private sector counterparts. We also work, of course, very extensively with our developing country counterparts. And so the question that I really wanted to pose to you, that if we're talking to our development country counterparts, what are the top things or the top 2 or 3 things that you really would suggest they can do to improve the environment, to improve their attractiveness for sourcing, for production, for investment? I know that's a tough issue to synthesize or to boil down to its essence, but how would you respond to that question? Patrick, perhaps if I can start with you.
Sure, Paul. My lens is managing customs and trade compliance, and our focus is always on capacity building around the knowledge of the preference programs, the rules that are involved in making these decisions, and the process, the systems and platforms necessary to support trade within these preference programs. You know, a lack of any one of those elements will undermine utilization of the programs. They can be complicated. I mentioned in my presentation that even with GSP in the U.S., suppliers oftentimes simply don't know the rules. The importer has to be very closely engaged, put strict processes in place, audit to ensure that we're compliant in making these declarations. So capacity building both in knowledge systems is imperative.
Thanks, Patrick. Does anybody else want to tackle that question?
Yeah.
All right, well,
Paul, let me jump in here.
Please, Bob.
I would add a couple of things. First of all, stability is important for us, and whether it's currency or whether it's the political environment or whether it's labor, they're all important. And I would encourage people to be good global actors. And by that, I mean, be respectful of human rights, be conscious of the environment, look and try and build a culture that's based on free, fair, and honest trade. And I think that those things are critical going forward as we look at partners and as we look at moving forward as to how we can build relationships.
Thanks, Bob. Greg, did you have your hand up as well?
Yeah, Paul, I think for the Children's Place, there's 3 things that are important. I would say the first being constant and consistent government support for investors, helping the investors work through issues and challenges, I think is really important. 2, for the governments to support the availability of labor, help put the infrastructure in place to allow those workers to come safely to and from the workplace. And then thirdly, ensuring that the infrastructure in place, is in place as the colleagues talked, roads, rails, ports, etc. Thank you.
Thanks. And Ken, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Greg's got it spot on there for us. I mean, no two brands, no two investors are the same. So just having a prescription for a new investor to come into a country, that's not the landing lights that you need. You need to be agile. You need to bend to meet certain different brand and investment needs. And then I would say to you, look, a strong banking apparatus. I think that's incredibly important today, particularly when there are strains around the world on foreign exchange. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I see that we have 2 hands up, and that's probably about as much time as we have left. So I'll ask Julia Grubler to start and pose your question, and then we'll turn to Abu Saleh. We'll take both of those questions, and then we'll turn it to our speakers for their response. So Julia, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance to ask the questions. So the presentations were super interesting. And I have one more general and one very specific one. The general one is in the context of that we have this session in the Aid for Trade conference. My question would be whether, given all the different factors that are influencing companies' decision to locate their production, whether they'd rather see Aid for Trade priorities more in the sphere of trade facilitation and in improving the business environment, or rather, what was also mentioned quite often, in improving the hard infrastructure that is necessary for trade. And on the more specific question, I was very much intrigued by the figures presented by Kent in the very beginning on the differences between the preference utilization, differences in the schemes and also across countries, with the AGOA of more than 80% and GSP below 50. And then listening to these interesting stories of the the industry representatives, I was wondering whether there's some research going on or whether there's already some research out that would show that AGOA, for example, is simply more attractive for multinationals, for US firms investing there and importing back to the US, whereas the lower preference utilization could be related to more local exporters in developing countries, in least developed countries, trying to export to the US. But this is just coming up to my mind, so I'm really not an expert in this. I'm curious what the presenters would argue. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Julia. And if I may ask, I should have said beforehand, could you please identify yourself and your affiliation?
Oh, sure. I'm an economist at the World Trade Organization, Julia Gruber.
Very good. Thank you. Abu Saleh, can you pose your question? Please identify yourself and your affiliation. No? All right, well then, if we could just proceed to respond to Julia's question, who would like to tackle that? Kent?
Well, I can say a little bit. As I noted in my remarks regarding the numbers, what we see is that where there is a particular commodity such as petroleum, we do see higher utilization rates. When we also do see a handful of countries that have zero utilization rates. So I'll be happy to go back and look at some of the literature and forward that literature to you as well. But it seems that there is sort of widespread disengagement in certain beneficiary countries, which is surprising. And those countries where you have one or two commodities that dominate the composition of exports, you do see higher overall preference utilization. But you do ask an interesting question, and I'm going to go back to the literature and see if I can extract some of the findings. I'll be happy to send the original documents to you as well.
Thank you, Kent. Anyone else want to respond to Julia's questions about the Aid for Trade priorities?
Just on her specific point there about, are perhaps, I think she hit the nail on the head actually when she said, look, maybe some of the multinationals will have a higher level of awareness on what the duty preferences are and how you work within them, because within the mechanisms, it may be that that sort of the subplot of the subplot is there are things that need to be clearly understood when you're entering into a duty arrangement, particularly when you're developing a product for the US market. There's a number of criteria that have to be met. And I think sometimes some of the local products, local producers need a sort of technical linkage almost, to bring them up to speed on what they need to do to take advantage of the duty preferences. That's certainly my experience in East Africa when I've talked to people on things like market gardening and fruit and vegetables and fisheries.
Thank you, Ken. Well, I think unless there's any other comments, we've probably stretched the goodwill of the WTO as far as we can, having run over by 25, almost 30 minutes. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our participants, particularly our speakers, all excellent presentations. I want to make sure to recognize the primary organizer of this event, Emanuela Montanari-Stevens at the Office of the United States Trade Representative's Office. I think we've really had a great session and provided some excellent insights into the issues related to preferences and preference utilization. Thanks again to everyone. Thanks to all of the attendees. And we'll look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.